Mara Voss laid her last silver $50 in the auctioneer's palm. Behind her, a black stallion hit the rails so hard one plank split down the middle. The crowd laughed. Mara had no saddle, no rope, and no place to sleep. She had just spent everything she owned on the most feared animal in Copper Mesa. Then she opened the gate, and the horse stopped screaming. The summer of 1886 had burned the Montana Territory pale. By late August, the grass had gone the color of old straw. The creek was low, and tempers were shorter than the shade. Mara entered town on foot, carrying a canvas bag, a folding knife, a tin cup, and a Bible with her dead husband's name written inside, Thomas Voss. A fever had taken him 12 days east of Fort Benton. Mara had buried him beneath a cottonwood with a borrowed shovel, then kept walking west because turning around would not bring him back. By the time she reached Copper Mesa, one boot had split at the toe. The $50 in her pocket was all she had left. She came looking for water. Instead, she heard a horse trying to break himself apart. Nearly 50 people had gathered behind Bain's Feed and Grain. Inside a high-board pen, the stallion was black from nose to tail except for a thumb-sized white mark beneath his left eye. Sweat covered his neck. A broken lead rope dragged from his halter. Blood ran along one shoulder where rope had burned through skin. His eyes showed white. The crowd called it fury. Mara knew better. Fury moves toward a target. Fear has nowhere to go. It circles. Under the sweat, she saw old straight scars along his ribs. Somebody had taught that horse that ropes meant pain. A man in a gray coat stepped onto a feed crate. He was broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, and tired in the way of someone who had spent years holding himself together. His name was Gideon Reed. "I bought Blackbird 7 months ago," he said. "4 capable men have tried him. 2 were badly hurt. If no one takes him today, I will make another decision before sundown." Nobody asked what decision. They understood. A rancher offered $5. Another offered $2. The crowd laughed. Mara looked at Blackbird. Beneath the panic was exhaustion, and beneath the exhaustion, attention. He was listening for the next thing that would hurt. "I'll take him," she said. Every face turned. A lean man near the gate folded his arms. He wore a clean vest, a silver watch chain, and a calm expression that did not feel peaceful. "Silas Crow." "Mom," he said. "That horse put a man through a stall wall, I heard." "You own a ranch?" "No." "A barn?" "No." "Then what exactly do you have?" Mara lifted the $50. "This." For 1 second the yard was silent. Then it broke open. $50. "She'll be dead before supper." "Does the coin include a coffin?" Mara kept her eyes on Gideon. He was not laughing. "You know horses, Mrs. Voss? My father gentled cavalry remounts in Missouri. I worked inside round pens before I could read." Silas gave a quiet snort. "This is not a farm gelding." "No," Mara said. "This is a horse that has never been given enough room to discover what he is." Something tightened behind Silas's eyes. Gideon looked toward Blackbird. The stallion had stopped moving. His head was turned toward Mara. $50, Gideon said. "Everything I have." He held out his hand. "Done." Silas stepped forward. "This is foolish." Gideon did not look at him. "Open the gate." The latch lifted. Mara entered with empty hands. Blackbird spun toward her, every muscle gathered. Mara turned slightly sideways. She did not reach. She did not stare into his eyes. Trust was too large a word for a first meeting. She simply stopped adding pressure. The stallion took 2 hard steps toward her. Mara stayed where she was. "I won't put a rope on you," she said quietly. His ears flicked forward. "Not today." He came close enough that she felt heat rolling from his chest. "You've had enough men prove they can tighten something around you. I am not here to tighten anything." Minutes passed. Blackbird circled once, snorted against her sleeve, jumped back, then came again. At last, he lowered his nose beside her shoulder and released one long breath. Not peace, but the first small release from panic. Mara turned toward Gideon. "He needs clean water. No men inside this pen. Move the other horses away from this wall." Silas almost laughed. "She pays 50 cents and starts giving orders." Gideon watched the horse, then Mara. "You heard her." That night Mara slept above Mrs. Bell's bakery in exchange for scrubbing pans before dawn. She had no money, no plan, and a horse nobody could touch. For the first time since Thomas died, she knew exactly where she would be in the morning. For the next 12 mornings, Mara gave Blackbird the one thing every man before her had taken away: choice. On the first morning, she sat outside the pen. On the second, just inside the gate. On the third, she moved the water closer and left before he drank. She never chased him into a corner, never blocked his escape, never made his fear prove itself. A young stable hand named Eli Boone brought water and questions. How long before you ride him? I don't know. A week? If you walk toward a frightened thing while thinking only about the day you plan to use it, your body tells the truth. Eli frowned. You think he reads minds? No, he reads shoulders, hands, breath. The part of a man that speaks before his mouth does. Eli tried to relax. His shoulders rose. Mara almost smiled. That is not relaxing. How do I stop trying? That is the work. After several quiet minutes, Blackbird lowered his head and ate. Eli whispered, he did it. No, Mara said. We stopped preventing it. Copper Mesa watched from a safe distance. Gideon watched from closer. He began appearing at dawn with coffee, leaning against the corner post and saying little. At first, Mara thought he was measuring progress. Then she realized he was learning how to stand still. On the 9th morning, Blackbird let her lift the broken rope from the dirt. She carried it outside and cut it into pieces. Silas watched from the barn. That was good rope. It had become a bad memory. Rope is rope, not to the horse. Silas stepped closer. Everything on this ranch has a use. So does space. Gideon came around the barn. Silas. One word was enough. Silas left, pleasant as ever. Blackbird did not approach again that morning. The air had tightened. On the 10th day, Gideon brought 2 cups of coffee. My wife made it stronger, he said. Maid? Louisa died 4 winters ago, lung fever. Our boy died the same week. Mara did not offer the small, useless word people used when they wanted grief to end quickly. She asked, what was his name? Samuel. Thomas was 35. They sat without speaking. Blackbird moved closer to the quiet between them. Gideon looked at him. Silas says you are making the horse dependent on you. Silas mistakes dependence for anything he cannot control. He has been with me 9 years. That does not make him wrong. No, it does not make him right either. A corner of Gideon's mouth moved. Not a smile yet, but it remembered how. On the 12th morning, Blackbird crossed the pen on his own. He stopped beside Mara, lowered his head, and pressed the white mark beneath his eye against her palm. Mara closed her fingers against his face. Something frozen inside her shifted. Behind the rail, Eli wiped his sleeve across his eyes. Dust, Mara asked. Terrible amount. Gideon had seen everything. That evening, he hired her to work with the other horses and teach Eli. Within weeks, Mara proved the ranch's bad horses had reasons. A roan mare bit because a cracked buckle had rubbed her raw. A gelding refused the creek because a rusted wagon tongue lay beneath the water. A young bay shook at chains because he had once been trapped in a freight wreck. One by one, the monsters became injuries, memories, and mistakes. And every reason Mara uncovered made Silas look less like an expert. He remained polite. That was what made him dangerous. Gideon began spending evenings on Mrs. Bell's porch with Mara. They spoke about Missouri, Louisa, Thomas, and why 2 grieving people had continued moving long after they had forgotten where they meant to go. One evening after work, Gideon asked why she had continued west after Thomas died. Mara watched the last light leave the road. Thomas and I spent 2 years saving for that journey. Every choice we made pointed west. After the fever, turning back felt like letting the fever choose the rest of my life. So you kept moving. I did not know how to do anything else. Gideon nodded. I know that kind of motion. He had spent 4 years moving through ranch work because motion required less from him than living. Mara understood without forcing him to say it. By the end of September, Blackbird followed Mara loose through the pen. No rope, no bridle. She laid her arms across his back, waited for him to settle, then lifted herself onto him bareback. Blackbird took 1 step, then another. He crossed the pen at a walk while the ranch forgot to breathe. When Mara slid down, Gideon smiled fully. Silas saw her see it, and in that moment, the problem stopped being a horse. It became a woman who had arrived with nothing and was slowly giving Gideon Reed his life back. The ranch held its autumn sale on the first Saturday of October. Buyers came from Helena and Great Falls, the yard filled with cattle, wagons, dust, and men who spoke loudly whenever money was near. Silas let a question spread through the crowd. Could the famous half-dollar stallion behave outside one quiet pen? Gideon refused to make Blackbird an exhibition. Mara looked toward the pasture. Blackbird had carried her there for 8 mornings. He was ready for an ordinary ride. What he was not ready for was a crowd waiting to be proven right. If I ride, Mara said, 1 circuit, no tricks. No shouting. Gideon pushed the crowd back. Eli brought the saddle and pad. Mara checked the girth and blanket. Then a cow broke loose near the lower gate. For half a minute the yard fractured into movement. Silas stepped out of the tack room carrying a coil of rope. He brushed past the saddle. Nobody noticed. Mara mounted. Blackbird took 10 perfect steps. At the far end of the yard, his back tightened. Not gradually, all at once. His breath snapped short. He crow-hopped once, then exploded. He launched upward, twisted, and came down with his spine arched. Mara stayed through the first buck. The second tore one hand from the rein. On the third, the saddle rolled. She hit the ground hard enough to lose sound. Blackbird struck at his own belly, twisting toward the saddle as if something beneath it were biting him. Someone yelled for a rifle. Gideon drew his revolver. Mara forced air into her lungs. No, Blackbird kicked free and bolted toward an open lane. A little girl in a yellow bonnet stood frozen in his path. The crowd screamed. Blackbird! The stallion's head snapped toward Mara's voice. Pain fought memory. Then he swerved. He missed the child by less than a foot and crashed through the side rail instead. Mara got to one knee. Look at the saddle. Eli lifted the pad from the dust. Blood spread across the wool. A short copper tack had been hidden inside it, angled upward so Mara's weight would drive it into Blackbird's back. The yard went silent. Mara looked at Silas. He still held the rope. His face showed exactly the correct amount of shock. Dr. Amos Vale examined the puncture. The wool was slit, the tack inserted, then combed over. This was deliberate. Silas folded his arms. It proved sabotage. Not who did it. No, Mara said. It proved someone knew exactly when I would mount. Silas looked at Gideon. I have protected this ranch for 9 years. I was here after Louisa. I kept the books, the men, and you standing. Now a widow arrives with a coin and a wounded animal, and every rule that kept this place alive is called cruelty. The crowd listened. This was no longer about the tack. Maybe it never had been. Gideon looked tired for one instant. 9 years against 6 weeks. History against a rival. Then his face settled. You earned the right to answer a plain question, he said. Did you put that tack in the pad? No. Then give Sheriff Tobin your room key and stay where he can find you. For the first time, Silas's pleasant mask cracked. The sheriff found an invoice in his desk for fine copper upholstery tax. A ranch hand remembered Silas asking whether Mara would ride Blackbird at the sale. Another had heard him say a public failure would settle the foolishness. It was enough for suspicion, not enough for conviction. Silas remained under watch. Near midnight, Mara woke in Gideon's spare room to the smell of smoke. The east stable was burning, and Blackbird was inside. Mara and Gideon reached the yard together. Flames had climbed the tackroom wall into the hayloft. The main doors were not merely latched. They had been chained shut. 14 horses screamed inside. Where is Silas? Gideon asked. Nobody answered. A narrow folding door on the north wall had not caught yet. Mara ran toward it. Gideon caught her wrist. No, the chain will take too long. We break the wall. The loft will fall first. Mara. She looked at him. He was not trying to control her. He was trying to keep one more person from entering a place he might not get them back from. She covered his hand with hers. I will open the north run. When they come, give them room. Do not catch them. Do not shout, the old language. Gideon released her. Eli pulled rails from the folding door. I am coming. No, the gray mare will only pass me. Mara saw his fear and the choice beneath it. Stay behind me. If I say out, you go out. They wrapped wet grain sacks around their shoulders and kicked the door open. Smoke rolled over them. Inside, orange light moved where walls should have been. Mara crouched beneath the smoke. Open the north stalls. Turn them toward the door and get clear. Eli freed the gray mare. Mara opened 2 more. A bay ran. A sorrel froze until Eli struck the boards behind him. They moved deeper. Blackbird waited in the center box, terrified but not throwing himself against the walls. The bolt had warped. Mara drove her folding knife beneath the latch plate until the wood split. The door opened. Blackbird came out. He did not run. 3 horses remained on the south side. Mara turned toward them. Blackbird turned with her. No, she said. Go. He stayed. Eli appeared through the smoke. General Pike will not move. The old chestnut stood with his head against the wall. Beyond him, the tack room roof collapsed. Mara opened the stall. General did not react. The roof groaned. 30 yards away, the north door framed clean night. Room, Mara pointed toward General. Bring him. Blackbird stepped into the stall and pressed his chest against the old horse's shoulder. General lifted his head. Blackbird pushed again. 1 step, then another. Eli moved behind him. Mara led them into the aisle as burning timber fell behind them. Go, Eli passed through the door. General followed. Blackbird reached the threshold. Then a roof beam cracked above Mara. Gideon shouted from outside. The beam struck her shoulder and drove her to the floor. Her left arm would not move. Blackbird was already outside. Good, she thought. At least he was free. Then the stallion came back. He stepped through the smoke, put his head beneath Mara's right arm and pushed. The beam shifted. Mara dragged one knee free. Blackbird pushed again until she crawled from beneath the timber. She grabbed his mane with her good hand. There was no clean mount. She jumped once and failed. Blackbird lowered himself just enough. Mara pulled across his back. "Door," she whispered. They burst into the yard as the center roof folded behind them. Gideon pulled Mara down into his arms. "All out," she coughed. "All 14. Blackbird placed his nose against her shoulder. Sheriff Tobin arrived before dawn. He found kerosene in the tack room, the watchman unconscious behind the grain shed, and Silas's bunk empty. Under the bed was a satchel containing the missing tacks, a stable key, 2 kerosene bottles, the ranch payroll, and Gideon's bill of sale for Blackbird. Across the bill, Silas had written what the Stallion could bring from a rendering buyer if declared permanently dangerous. The amount was not large. That made it worse. Silas had risked 14 horses and 3 human lives to restore an order in which Gideon needed him. Mara looked foolish and force appeared right again. Gideon stood in the wet ash. "I trusted him with everything." "You trusted what he had been," Mara said. "What if he was always this?" "He was not. That is why betrayal hurts." Gideon looked toward Blackbird. "He came back for you. He came back because he had room to leave. All those weeks, every man had tried to keep Blackbird by closing something around him. A rope, a gate, a leg, a hand. Mara had opened space, and when the door stood open, Blackbird chose her. Sheriff Tobin caught Silas 2 days later at a Missouri River ferry. He carried Gideon's watch, the stolen payroll, and burns across both hands. Silas was brought back in irons. The town gathered outside the sheriff's office. 6 weeks earlier, those people had laughed when Mara spent her last coin. Now they moved aside when she passed. Silas looked through the bars. "You ruined this place." Mara glanced toward Reed Ranch where Blackbird waited in an open corral. "No," she said. "I opened a gate." The evidence left little room for invention. Silas was convicted of arson, theft, cruelty, and destruction of ranch property. When the verdict was read, Gideon placed his hand over Mara's. She turned her palm upward. That was all. It was enough. Outside the courthouse, the father of the girl in the yellow bonnet removed his hat. "I called that horse a killer," he said. "I said it where my daughter could hear." Mara looked at the child beside him. She carried a cloth bag of apples. "He was in pain," Mara said. "I know that now." The girl offered Mara the bag. "One is for him." Mara took it. "He will like that." By the following month, 7 ranchers had asked Mara to examine horses everyone else had given up on. Gideon rebuilt the east stable before winter. The new aisle was wider. Every stall opened into an outside run. Every door could be released from both sides. Nothing frightened would ever again be trapped by one man's key. At the far end, he built Mara a large round working yard with no sharp corners. "You made it large," she said. "You keep saying room matters." "It does." I listened. Blackbird walked through the open gate, circled once, and returned to Mara. By spring, horses were arriving from 3 counties. Mara promised no miracles. She promised observation, time, and honest work. A savage mare became gentle after a rotten tooth was removed. A remount stopped throwing riders when Mara replaced a saddle tree that pinched his spine. A terrified wagon horse worked again after she found the old scar explaining his fear. Over 5 years, more than 200 horses passed through the Copper Mesa yard. The work paid for the rebuilt stable, then a second barn, then 80 acres adjoining Reed Ranch. Gideon put Mara's name beside his on the deed. That winter, he asked her to marry him at the kitchen table. "I do not want to give you another place you can be trapped," he said. "The work remains yours. Nothing is taken back. But I want you beside me." His voice shook once. "Would you choose to stay?" Mara thought of Thomas, the cottonwood grave, and the road that had seemed endless. Then she thought of Blackbird standing in an open gate with every chance to run. "I already did. They married in April." Eli cried openly. Mrs. Bell fed half the territory. The girl in the yellow bonnet brought Blackbird a red apple. After the ceremony, Mara entered his stall in her cream dress and placed both hands against his face. "We were supposed to be ruined," she told him. Blackbird breathed against her palms. Blackbird lived 13 more years. He never became a horse for everyone. Mara refused to make that the measure of success. He carried her. Later he carried Gideon. He guided frightened young horses across water through wagon noise and past the blackened foundation of the old stable. When another animal panicked, Blackbird did not pull against the rope. He waited for it to go slack, then he moved. Children grew up knowing the simple version. A poor widow bought a killer horse for 1 silver coin. The horse saved 14 animals from a fire. The widow married the rancher. When they were older, they came to Mara for the harder version. They asked why Blackbird had been dangerous. She showed them the scars. They asked why Silas hated her. Some people do not fear change, she said. They fear becoming unnecessary. One autumn afternoon, a boy asked, "Did you save Blackbird?" Mara was 50 by then. Silver threaded her hair. Blackbird stood beyond the fence, old and quiet. "I gave him room. Is that the same as saving him?" "No." The boy waited. "He saved himself. That is why the room mattered." "Then what did he do for you?" Mara remembered the road after Thomas died. Every morning, another mile. Every night, another place she did not belong. She had mistaken motion for survival because stopping meant feeling everything she had lost. Then a black horse screamed behind a fence, and her feet turned toward him. "He gave me a reason to stop walking," she said. Blackbird died the following spring with Mara beside him and Gideon's hand on her shoulder. There was no struggle. Only one final breath beneath her palm. They buried him on the rise above the stable, facing the open north pasture. No rope, no gate, nothing closed around him. Years later, travelers still asked where the famous $50 horse had been kept. Mara would point to the wide yard, the open-run stalls, the 2 barns, and the acres their work had bought. Then she would point toward the rise. People liked to say she spent her last coin on a worthless horse. They had the story backward. Mara spent her last coin on a horse everyone had tried to hold by force. Blackbird gave her room enough to live again.